So, Daniel 3, the children's story, but it is so much more than a children's story. So it starts off, as you see if you look at verse 1, it starts off with Nebuchadnezzar building a statue 90 feet high made of gold. Now, this follows on from chapter 2. If you remember chapter 2 from 2 weeks ago, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Do you remember of the statue? And the head of the statue is gold. And then we have, other metals as the statue goes down and the feet of iron and clay at the bottom. Do you remember that? Well, in what seems to be an act of pride, Nebuchadnezzar takes this dream and then makes it into a reality, but he exaggerates it, and rather than having the head of gold, he makes the whole thing out of gold. Okay? 90 feet high. This apparently represents him and his status. Now, we don't know what the statue is. It doesn't tell us what the statue is. But it highlights that the king and the gods were very much interwoven in Babylon. Kings of that era were considered a kind of deity, that some of them were considered sons of the gods. And so bowing down to this statue and worshipping it, as a Jew, you'd be considered breaking the first two commandments. First one, have no other gods before me. Second one, don't make any image of anything in the world, on the sea, under the sea and all the rest of it. Don't make anything and bow down to it. So they would have been guilty of breaking both commandments there. And for a Jew, of course, that's a no-no. And for these three guys in the story, all eyes are looking at them because they're now in positions of power. It doesn't mention about the other Jews in captivity. We don't know whether they've bowed down or not, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're in positions of power and authority. We don't know where Daniel is. Some people think Daniel's maybe doing other work somewhere else in another province or something like that, but wherever he is, we just don't know where he is. But these three are in positions of power, so all eyes are on them. So we have the statue built in verse 1, and in verse 2 we have foreign dignitaries and from all around, all these prefects and all the satraps and all whatever they are, come to worship this statue. Now look at verse 4, because it talks about these people from every language coming to worship the statue. Do you see that? So look at the pride there. You have people from all across the known world, different tribes and nations, different languages coming together to worship the statue that Nebuchadnezzar built. Now, that's pride in contrast to Daniel in chapter 2, because Daniel in chapter 2, do you remember when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream? And he says, I've had a dream. And his advisors say, well, tell us what it is and we'll interpret it. And he's like, no, I want you to tell me what the dream is and then interpret it. And when it comes to Daniel, Daniel says, if you remember, he says, I can't interpret this dream, but I know a God who can. So there's humility with Daniel, and we've pride with Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to see what happens in the pride, because pride is a big sort of theme in Daniel as well. And we'll see that later on in the next two chapters with him and his son when we look at them, because Nebuchadnezzar is going to fall in a minute. So he gets all these people to worship. Now, notice where they're coming from. I want you to think about this. All these people, different places around the known world, different languages, coming to worship this huge statue that Nebuchadnezzar has built. I want you to see if you can work it out. Can you see the parallel here between some other story in Genesis? Yeah. So this is taking place in Babylon. Okay? The people are coming from all these different places, speaking different languages, and I said it twice there about the different languages. And what's Nebuchadnezzar trying to do with his pride and the statue? He's trying to make a name for himself. So, that's the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel, what did they do? They built a huge tower, paralleled with Nebuchadnezzar building the huge statue. They wanted to make a name for themselves, and that's what the words that is used in the Genesis story. But also then at the Tower of Babel, those people are scattered and they're given different languages. And now we have all these different languages coming back to worship this tower. And as I've said before, Babel in the Hebrew, and it's translated everywhere else in the Old Testament, is translated as Babylon. It's only in Genesis 11 where it's translated as Babel. It's the same Hebrew word. So the Tower of Babel is the Tower of Babylon. So what you have here is Nebuchadnezzar trying to, in a sense, recreate this whole Tower of Babel, trying to reverse it, bring all the languages back. Let's worship this statue. In fact, let's worship me. Trying to make a name for himself there. But like I said, this is the whole thing about pride in Daniel. Pride comes before a fall, and Nebuchadnezzar is about to fall, and you'll see that soon enough. So the herald proclaims, verse 4, nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the instruments, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up, and whoever does not fall down, verse 6, will be thrown into a blazing furnace. And of course, everyone bows down, except for these three Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in positions of power. Like I said, all eyes are on them. And the people in Babylon are possibly envious of them because they are in positions of power. And they come forward, verse 8, these astrologers come forward and they denounce the Jews. And they say to the king, remember you asked everyone to bow down to this statue you built? Well, verse 12, there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, these guys Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Now look at verse 12 again. Now look at the personal pronouns used there. They're making it personal to Nebuchadnezzar. They don't pay any attention to you. They don't serve your gods. They don't worship the image of gold that you set up. And the commentators have picked up on this. They're making Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's refusal a personal attack on the king, when all they're doing is standing up for what they believe. It's not a personal attack on the king at all. They're just saying, this is not what we do. It goes against our beliefs. But they're making it a personal attack on the king. And so he's furious, calls them into his presence, gives them another chance. Giving you one more chance here. I'm going to play the music, and if you don't bow down, you're going into this furnace. Now look at their response, because this is the key part of the chapter. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to King Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Now, everyone else talking to the king beforehand, and so far in Daniel, say, may the king live forever. All his own advisors and stuff, as soon as they mention his name, it's may the king live forever. They don't do that here. It's simply, King Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to do this. And if we're thrown into the fire, then the God we serve will deliver us from it. And that's true, because God would be able to deliver them from it. He can do whatever he wants. He has a power to do that. And we know that he does. But they go a step further. They say, not only can he deliver us from it, but he will deliver us from your hand. A lot of faith there. But then there's a wee bit added, which I think is quite unique. Verse 18, he says, God will deliver us. He will deliver us. But if he doesn't, we're still not going to worship your gods. Does that sound like doubt there? Apparently not. They're confident that God will save them. But at the same time, they don't presume on his deliverance. They don't direct the hands of God. Now, I want you to think of the people who are reading this in exile. And even people in exile today, for example, or you think of people, maybe Muslim countries, who are standing up for the Lord, feeling like a foreigner in their lands. Some of them may not be delivered from exile. Some of them may not be delivered from persecution. But God is able to deliver them. But he may not deliver them. And given the length of time these guys were in exile, 50 or 60 years, some of the people brought into exile would not have survived the whole time in Babylon. So this speech of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is super critical to those who are reading this account, and super critical for us today. Because God is able to deliver us from the hands of evil. He's able to deliver us from persecution. Will he, though? That's up to him. But does that change how we consider him? Does that change how we view the Lord? If he doesn't deliver us from hard times, does that make a difference to how we worship him? See, according to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it makes no difference to them at all. They still worship him. They're still going to do what's right, regardless of whether or not God delivers them or not. And this is kind of riffing off Job. In the story of Job, the accusation was that Job was only worshipping God because he has so many blessings. He's got so much stuff. You take all that stuff away, see if the worship's there. And so what happens is all that stuff's taken away. Job still worships the Lord. It's kind of food for thought for us too. I think the big question in this that comes to my mind anyway is, do we love God and worship God because of the blessings he has given us? Are we worshiping him because he has saved us? If we weren't going to go to glory when we die, should we no longer worship him the way we do? In other words, do we worship God because of the stuff that he gives us and does for us? Or do we worship God because he is God and he's worthy of our worship, regardless of what we get or don't get? Big question, isn't it? I probably fall into the camp of the former, that I worship God because he has done all this stuff for me. It's kind of how my mind works and our mind works. Someone does something good for you, you thank them and you praise them. Thank you for doing that. In a sense, that's my worship, in a sense, is based on what God has done for me in Jesus Christ. But at the same time, I think the big thing for me, it spoke to me about this, is God still deserves our worship, regardless of what we get out of it. Moving on. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the furnace that's way hotter than it needs to be. The guards that throw him in are burnt when they throw him in. Just goes to show you how hot it is. And then the focus shifts off these guys and onto Nebuchadnezzar, who rises up in astonishment. Verse 24, look at verse 24. King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men we tied up and thrown into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. So there are 3 guys bound going into the furnace, and now all of a sudden there are now 4 unbound in the furnace, and one of them is like a son of the gods. Some commentators say it was an angel. Some people say it was the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Whoever it was God's deliverer who stood with them in the fiery trial. And again, think of the people reading this in exile. Think of those people reading this who are going through persecution. What you see from this is that God might not save them from the trial, but he stands with them in the trial. You see the difference there? They weren't saved from the fiery furnace. They had to endure the fiery furnace. But God stood with them and protected them in the fiery furnace. And that promise is true today. God's promise is that he'll never leave you or forsake you. He stands with you in the fiery trials. We may not escape them, but we have someone who stands with us in the middle of them. And this would provide great encouragement to those who are reading this in exile. And on a personal note, Kate and I, in a sense, are going through a trial of sorts with Naomi, and it's been brutal these last few months, and it's been a trial. But what we can testify to is that while God has not delivered us from this, he stands with us in the middle of it. And he's walking with us during this time. And that's how we can get through each day. I mentioned to you on Sunday, last Friday, I was at a meeting at Open Doors, and there was a lady there with her daughter from Malaysia. And as I said on Sunday morning, her husband was abducted in 2017 for preaching the gospel. And they haven't seen him since. They don't know if he's alive or dead, and they still continue to meet and to worship the Lord and to have their meetings. And, you know, they haven't been delivered from that trial. But to hear their talk and to hear their devotion to God, I mean, if it was me, you'd almost like pack it in. But God stands with them in that trial. And that's a really good lesson to learn, a reminder for us that whatever we're going through, God stands with you in it. Chapter ends then with Nebuchadnezzar calling Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the furnace. They see they weren't even singed. They don't even smell smoke. And then we have a turn of events at the end of the chapter. Look at verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He has sent his angel and rescued his servants, and they trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I'm going to make a decree," he says in verse 29, "that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." And then the king promoted these three in the province of Babylon. And the Jewish religion then is protected within Babylon for now, and we have a promotion. Again, a reminder that God does honor those who honor him. And their act of faith was like that of Daniel's. They took a stand for the Lord, and he blessed them for it. But remember, they knew that God was still to be worshipped and praised, even if he didn't rescue them. We don't worship God because of what he gives us. We worship him for who he is. 3 questions I want you to think about just as we close. And I want you to mull them over. I don't want a response, just want you to think about these. First question is this: what would you die for? What belief, faith, anything would you be willing to die for? Have you ever thought about that? Second question is this: what would you fight for, but you wouldn't die for it? You know, you'd fight strongly for it, but if it came to the crunch, you wouldn't give up your life for it. And then thirdly, what do you believe, but you'd give up without much fuss? It doesn't have to be theological even in a sense, but, you know, we're talking, do you have anything that you believe in strongly, but if it came to it, you know, you'd give it up without much of a fuss? I want you to think about those things. We're going to move to prayer in a second, but the questions I think that are good for us to consider in some ways: what would you die for? What would you be willing to die for? What would you fight for but not die for? And what do you believe but you would give up without much fuss?